Okay, special reports, early childhood specialist model, Dr. Jill Choko.
Good evening, President Lane, Board of Trustees, Superintendent Maleko. I would like to have our early childhood specialists who are able to be here tonight start off by introducing themselves.
Hello, my name is Ashley Rhodes, and I am the Early Childhood Specialist at Henry Ford Elementary.
Good evening. I'm Jan DeRossett. I'm the Early Childhood Specialist at Miller Elementary.
So to provide a little bit of background on the early childhood specialist model, what I'd like to start with is the process, just a very brief description of the process that the district engaged in as part of how this model came to be as it was piloted last spring. The district, being a little forward-thinking with the support of the board, engaged in that CPI, that continuous process improvement, and there was a committee called Read by Third Grade. And so there were teachers from K to 3 on the committee, there were administrators, and that committee came up with a list of recommendations after going through the rather complex and time-consuming process of examining data and looking at where students were, what is the research saying, and that was the CPI recommendations. The legislature approved the Read by Third Grade Act, Public Act 306, in October of 2016, just last October. So our school year had already started. And so one of the pieces of data that I'd like to share with you next would be the 3 years of NWEA data that we have. As you know, because the board supported this, that the district started to administer the NWEA assessments in 2014, and so we now have 3 years, and next year will be the beginning of the 4th, years of data as far as where are kindergarten students when they start with us. You know, certainly some of them have had preschool, not all of them have had the benefit of preschool, but where are we? And of course you can't just look at 1 year. You know, a trend is considered 3 or more years. So we now have 3 years of data, and as you can see, the graph that's lightest blue is where students start with in the fall. And then the next color is where they are in the wintertime. Usually the assessments are second, third week of January. And then where are students at the end of the year? And usually that's done the first or second week of May. So as you can see, beginning in 2014, 15% of our students were considered to be at grade level in starting the school year. And of course the flip side of that is 85% of them were below grade level. So we thought, all right, the assessments are new. We're going to work with this a little bit. The next year, as you can see, the kindergarten starting level, these are new students, only 8% of them were at grade level. But with the teaching expertise of the kindergarten teachers, you can see that those ending levels continue to rise each year, and as of May 2017, there were 25% of them were at grade level, which is a great increase, except that 75% of them are still not at grade level. So with everyone working very hard based on where our students are starting, we realized that we needed to make a change and get more of our kindergarten students at grade level from the very beginning. So Ashley and Jan and Kelly Mustin, who is not able to be here tonight, she's out of the country, began their early childhood specialists, so they began working with students, and we'll share a little bit more of the pilot with you as we move through. So the CPI recommendations, again, are summarized briefly here. Essentially, what the CPI team recommendations were summarized as: all students benefit from research-based effective reading instruction. All teachers benefit from professional learning designed to help that teaching process move through effectively. Coaching, continue instructional coaching, provide additional classroom resources. Work on DEC, which is our Dearborn education curriculum, so that we will continue to improve the lesson planning and the standards-based instruction in terms of the base that are so important to provide a foundation, as well as, if there were funds, to include specialists to provide supplemental instruction for additional students. So that was the team's recommendation at the end of school year 2016. And then Public Act 306, again, which was enacted in October 2016, talked about the 5 components of reading. So again, effective reading instruction. Talked a lot about assessments, and the assessments that our district is currently using, the NWEA and the DRA, are among the approved lists of assessments. A lot of discussion on professional learning for staff. The legislation cites an individual reading improvement plan that must be in place for all students who are below grade level in reading. There is a parent education component, there is a required read at home program, and then there's an element of portfolios. So the measure of assessment of whether or not a student is at grade level comes in 3rd grade. As we know, the M-STEP, it begins to be administered in the 3rd grade, and if a student is not at grade level, as measured by the reading portion of that assessment, then the legislation requires students, unless there's a superintendent permission provided, to be retained in 3rd grade. So this year's kindergarten students would be the first cohort or the first group of students that potentially would be impacted by this legislation. The legislation also says that if the test scores don't show this, then the district can also choose to show this through a student portfolio and other test measures. So again, our district has had assessment measures in place for certainly a long period of time, and our administrators and classroom teachers, our instructional coaches, our English language development specialists are working together to ensure that not only do we increase the rigor of instruction, but we're also working to develop that portfolio so that if there are students that do not test well, that we can show their proficiency in other ways. So the early childhood specialist model, again, is a research-based intervention model, and very simply it supplements what classroom teachers are doing every day. So that the major components are the collaboration that then exists between the classroom teacher, who's with the kids virtually all day, except at lunch and during the special classes, and then the specialist who also is coming in to provide additional support. So the key is that common resource that was piloted with the classroom teachers in the 3 schools, so that the same resources are used by the classroom teacher and the specialist. So the data was examined to service the lowest achieving students as measured by the NWEA. And so part of this pilot was also to determine whether or not we were going to recommend that this be extended to all elementary schools, and to also work out some of the logistical kinds of things. What kind of assessments, when would they be administered, what do the schedules look like, some of those things that are very important to implementation. So I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Ashley, who's going to go through the next few slides.
So a vital part of the success for the ECS model is the partnership between the classroom teacher and the early childhood specialist. The classroom teacher will provide small group instruction to the lowest students 2 times a day. So those students are getting 2 dips of instruction by the classroom teacher. A 3rd dip of instruction comes in by the early childhood specialist. And the ECS will supplement the instruction with 4 to 5 additional sessions per week. We said 4 to 5 because once a week, starting out, we were meeting once a month for ECS meetings to establish the pilot and to establish the routines that would be happening, and then we back off of those meetings and then only have them once every few months to ensure that everyone is on the same page. Content aligned through common instructional resources. We use the LLI system, the Leveled Literacy Intervention System by Fontes and Pinnell, and we found great success with that program. The biggest success factor was that the classroom teacher and the ECS were using common language. Also, we will be providing weekly progress monitoring and entering time through MyStar. So the components of the ECS model, we always start with assessment. We use the DRA word analysis tasks. We use the hearing and recording sounds and concepts about print from the observation survey. There are an average 3 sessions per day of targeted intervention, 2 from the classroom teacher, 1 from the ECS, and also classroom teachers and the ECS are attending the weekly kindergarten grade level meetings. There's weekly progress monitoring, and within the LLI system, running records are happening every other day. And also, we will be tracking time. The kindergarten teachers will track their time that they're seeing the students, and also the ECS will be tracking their time that they see the students.
So the assessments that we use were the DRA, task analysis. There's a list of them there. Just starting out with distinguishing initial sounds, moving on, knowing their capital letters, lowercase letters, segmenting words auditorily from a sentence, recognizing high-frequency words. Children were also assessed on concepts about print, which is a key indicator of reading success, and of course, the text-level reading. We also assessed the children on the observation survey, which is the hearing and recording sounds. Out of those, we had 154 students that were assessed, kindergarten students. And these are the assessment results from the pilot from March to May. So you can see in the students that were performing instructionally their text level, at the beginning of the intervention, 66 were at the beginning reading level %, and at the end of the intervention, which was roughly about 8 weeks, 94% were at the beginning reading level. And if we looked at the assessment of knowing their capital letters, at the beginning of the intervention, 44% of the students knew all their capital letters. At the end of the intervention, that increased to 79% within an 8-week time period.
So based on feedback from teachers, the kindergarten teachers, and the elementary administrators, the decision was made to bring on additional early childhood specialists to continue to supplement the instruction of students. So that Dearborn teachers were interviewed, and there is now a group of 15. And that will be, the plan is to roll that out in the fall so that there will be professional development. They'll certainly spend some time getting to know the students, getting to know their community, getting to know the parents, complete the assessment of students, develop the learning goals, and by the end of the month, begin that supplemental instruction. So Ashley talked a little bit about the leveled literacy intervention systems. They have been around since about 2009, are heavily research-based, utilize the reading recovery model, which again has a lot of support and a lot of data regarding the strategies that are effective for students. So the goal is again to have a kit for the early childhood specialist and the classroom teacher. Professional development is also a major part of the plan, so that there will be additional professional learning provided for the kindergarten teachers throughout the year, with the goal of utilizing the classroom resources and providing optimum instruction for every student. Because many of the students do achieve grade level proficiency, the goal is to take students from the lowest on up and bring them to grade level, thereby increasing the, raising the floor so that more of our students, all of our students go to first grade reading at grade level. And again, I'd like to say a big thank you to Jan, Ashley, and Kelly, who were our pioneers in this. Both Jan and Ashley are new to our district. They started at the beginning of the year and made the very difficult decision to leave their current roles. Had experienced a lot of success there, but this was a very exciting model for them. We're very pleased that they made the decision to join Dearborn. Kelly Mustin was a current Dearborn teacher, so the three of them partnered and teamed, and we stayed in communication in order to kind of work out the bugs as we moved along.
Trustee Petchikoff.
We have 154 kids so far that we've tested this on in kindergarten. Are we going to continue to monitor their progress in first grade, second grade, third grade to see how successful the impact that they showed in kindergarten is sustainable with their
That's a great question.
reading?
Yeah, Dr. Patterson, we actually have an evaluation design for the program. The key also is to continue to provide
To add
solid
on.
instruction,
Right.
solid intervention for these same students, because again, the research shows that with that summer slide, the students who are most behind are the ones that tend to lose the most over that time. So again, since these were the lowest students, our goal would be to continue to provide that additional supplemental instruction, and the fact that early childhood specialists will be partnering with kindergarten teachers allows building administrators to use all of their other building resources to help the other students in the other classrooms.
Trustee Barry, did you have something?
Yes, here's your chance to plug our preschool program. Those students coming into our kindergartners, teen kindergartens classrooms, I know this is not a fair question, but how many of them are actually part of the cohort that's being tested?
That's a very good question, and I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't know.
Yeah.
There are 432 GSRP students right now. That is the total number of slots we have that the county provides. How many of them, the current kindergarten students, were in GSRP last year? We did not look at the data that way, but we can and we will. Dr. Patterson is actually finishing up a study of GSRP students and their performance on standardized test measures so that we can see what happens when they hit, I believe it's 5th grade and 8th grade in terms of their proficiency, and then how their performance compares to all of the other students who did not have preschool when the variables are controlled for demographically. So when you're comparing them with like students, how are the students who have had preschool, how do they benefit?
I'd love to
So that's a good question. I
Thank
don't know
you
the
very
answer.
much. I look forward to that.
Trustee Hamud?
We do have a high immigrant population, and a lot of our students are coming in with English as a second language. Does the data and those numbers, do they include or differentiate between which of these students came in already knowing the language, or some of the students are coming in that don't know the language?
Again, another great question. We serviced all students who had, based on the WIDA screener, what is a WIDA level 2, which means that students who score a 2 generally have enough language to be able to benefit from instruction in English. And usually the WIDA 1 levels are considered newcomers and receive some instruction in their native language as a bridge to learn English. All children benefit from a language-based program, so that even our students who come to us speaking English, their vocabulary is low, and we tend to have to do a lot of oral language development to expose them to the concepts and the vocabulary that is part of school language. Many of our students do not come with that, but we are servicing our ELs as well as our English students, so we didn't differentiate from that basis. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Are there, for example, extra resources needed in order to service the ELL learners as opposed to the non-ELL ELL students?
During the years of budget cuts, we trimmed drastically, and we cut back on adding to classroom libraries. We cut back on adding resources because we had to cut in lots of areas, and with the last few years, not having those budget cuts, we've gradually started to add to our instructional resources and books in the hands of children, manipulatives, language, all of those oral language experience, nursery rhymes, all of those experiences help build those young children's auditory language so that when reading instruction occurs, they're able to connect to print. I'm going to connect this up to Trustee Barry's question relative to preschool, knowing that a parent is always a child's first and lifelong teacher. The Early Learning Coalition that you've heard a lot about this year is that measure that is also designed to bring education and resources directly to parents. And so bringing toddlers in, bringing young children in, bringing three-year-olds in, and giving parents resources that they can use at home, showing them how to use them. Again, the funding and the donations that people have provided to the coalition is designed to help parents be very active. It doesn't matter what language the activity is in, but the idea is to have parents engage with children on the kinds of activities that will allow them to become more engaged with the activities once they get to school, and so that those norms of school are conducive for them. So we're trying to work with that early learning coalition and bring the infants and toddlers up at the same time. We have requested, with the board's support, additional preschool slots should Wayne County have slots to give us this year, because that again will allow us to serve more preschool students. And we'll just take the students that we have coming in, move them over a little bit, and we'll figure out a place to put them. But again, supplementing that with additional instruction for the kindergarten students so that all students make more gains early on, again, will it kind of raise the floor and allow more students to go to first grade reading at grade level.
That's awesome.
Trustee Thorpe?
I have two questions for you. The first goes along with what Trustee Barry was asking, but with a different twist. So we're looking at the test results to determine who's going to be part of the group. Do we wait until that first Nwea? Is there a screening that's done at the very beginning of the school year that figures that? Do we look at young fives and have them ready to go?
Again, another very good question. All of the above.
Okay.
Students who have been in Young Fives, we've had 4 programs in the district. So again, not a lot for the number of, we have anywhere between 1,450 to 1,500 kindergarten students each year. So our population in our Young Fives has been about 60 kids. And so the goal is to assess beginning that first full week of school. So again, we have a partial week, and there's a lot of norm setting. There's a soft start so that kids are introduced to school, introduced to the lunchroom. Again, it's a really big deal because that lunchroom can be very, very loud and noisy. But the teachers can get to know the parents, and then assessments will begin that next week, and our ECS will be assisting with assessments and leading some of those, so that within 2 weeks, the assessment data will be in, and we'll be able to determine the needs of the students and then can plan our service accordingly.
All right. The second question is, a lot of this is seeming to be focused on kindergarten, rightfully so, but you said that the kids that are going into first grade will be the first group that needs to be up and running by third. So are we also starting to work then with the first grade teachers, and then assuming next year we'd be working with the second grade, so that, again, by the time they hit third grade, they're proficient?
Again, looking at the number of students in first grade, that right now we're looking at about 75% of this year's kindergartners going into first grade not proficient. So there is a great need there. In working with building principals, we're going to determine the extent of that need, and if we need to redeploy early childhood specialists or possibly add to them, again, depending on what our superintendent recommends and what our board approves, we'll have to take a look at that, because our kindergartners are new. We're basing next year's plan on what we've had the last few years. Now, again, we don't know all of the students yet, so some of the students that we think are coming to this school may not end up coming to that school. There may be more students coming to another building. So again, it's another very good question, because we've missed kind of that bubble with next year's first grade students, and if we need to adjust and redeploy staff or possibly add to them again, depending on our recommendations, we'll take a look at that.
Okay, thanks.
I was kind of clobbered by the slide showing 8% at level. That really surprised me. I guess I'm trying to back myself into a more comfortable place, but I have to ask Dr. Patterson and you, Dr. Chokol, historically, is that pretty normal? Is that typical? Because although you have 3 years of data, kindergarten roundup has been done for decades. My mother did kindergarten roundup many years ago, and while you don't have data from that, there is information that people know how many incoming, and I see Dr. Patterson's kind of shaking his head. So is that normal? I know we live in a unique city. And I recognize also that second language learners start out behind and then they speed up on their progress. So I'm just wondering, because that 8%, 11%, 15%, it unsettles me. And especially in the wealth, the environment that we're in now, there's a wealth of PBS shows and educational, Young Einstein, and for certain people get exposed to a lot of that, so I'm a little shocked by 11%.
So I would say that historically in, urban environments like our own, the majority of students do enter kindergarten behind in early literacy skills. The cut point that we use to determine the 8 and 12 and 15% is a cut point for kind of college and career readiness that we've used on our report cards that's been used to kind of show where students need to be on track to enter college at the level that they need to in terms of reading skills. So although that does seem very low, we know that it is somewhere in that ballpark. Another issue that we do have at the beginning of the year is often when kids are coming in and taking an assessment for the first time, it's new to them. It takes them a little while to get used to taking a test, which they haven't done before. So oftentimes you do identify a few students that might not necessarily be in that low group. But regardless of that, the number of students that we do have coming in that are in that need is within that range. So that's what we've been using because based on the historical data, we know that it is a vast majority of our students that enter at that level.
I have a quick question.
Trustee Nasser.
I know with the Young Fives program, you only take students that have birthdays between September and November because they'll be kind of the oldest in the group, in the class, correct?
The window for Young Fives is roughly June 15th to December 1st. So we use the later birthday as a guideline. We have had students enroll in the Young Fives kindergarten who have had birthdays earlier than that. It is a lot of counseling with parents, talking with them about their child. They know their child certainly, and we don't because they haven't been in school. And so the administrator of the school where the Young Fives program is spends a lot of time talking with the parent about the child, what kind of setting, what kind of other experiences, what makes them, because parents will seek out a Young Five, and there's a reason why they do it. We don't always know what that reason is, but the focus truly, although the kindergarten curriculum is taught, the focus is on social, emotional, maturity, sharing, a lot of the affective, kinds of qualities that, contribute to a young child's development. And some kids, it's truly the gift of time. They do need more time, and they get that extra year before moving into kindergarten.
Okay, so then when students are signed up for kindergarten, is there any type of packet that can be sent to them in the mail for the parents to go over with them in the summer just to see what kind of, just to get them going? Because I feel I've had all of my 3 kids have gone through early childhood programs. My son is going to kindergarten and he's multiplying. He's 5 years old. And my 4-year-old has been reading since he was 4 because of these programs that I'm putting my kids in. And so when I see these numbers, I'm just baffled because even the 25% is still really low. But there is gradual increases in each year. But if there's any way we can just kickstart it, so that way when we do assessments in the fall, they've had some taste of the alphabet and being able to recognize some of the letters and things before they get to kindergarten, if they haven't had any programs prior, or even if they have, it's just kind of a review.
The kindergarten roundups, as you know, are all site-based, so each of the schools organizes them a little bit differently, holds it on their schedule. They have a different routine in terms of people. There's a lot of similarity, but there are certainly some differences based on the school population, teachers being involved, some of the other support services, social worker that come and speak to parents, as well as tours of the school. Many of the schools also do a lot of assessing of students when they come in, maybe not at the roundup time, but as a follow-up, parents will make an appointment, the child will come in, they'll do some assessments to find out where the students are, so that the grouping that is done for children that we don't know yet then can be done with the student's best interests in mind. Many of the families are provided with materials. I don't have a list of exactly what's done, but most of the schools do provide families with some. Years ago, we did a kindergarten backpack, and provided students with some of the materials that kind of went the way of the budget cuts. So schools individualize as far as what resources they're providing to families. But that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
It is a good suggestion. We should probably do something in conjunction with the Dearborn libraries as well.
We provide parents with the summer reading program for the library and do a lot of sharing of things that are out there. We also have the MobiMax, which is an online resource that some families can access. But again, if they don't have technology at home relative to a screen that's big enough for, for little eyes to see, that may not be a resource that's used as well as it is by older students.
Good, great. Good, thank you very
Great
much.
report, thank you.
Dr.
Comment. Yeah, I just wanted to say, appreciate the presentation and want to thank the taxpayers that voted for the Wayne County Enhancement Millage, because that is what is funding this program, this model. And I know in Dearborn we want to make, bring this model forward for our support of early childhood. That is very important. I know it was something that was very popular when we were doing the surveys of what we would spend the money on from the taxpayers. So I just wanted to mention that. And secondly, as we piloted it at the 3 schools, I did walk into one of the kindergarten planning meetings at River Oaks when I happened to be there for a visit, and it was really positive. And the professional learning community model is kind of all-encompassing and everywhere, and it's kind of outreaching, and that's what they were doing in their teams. And at our administrative retreat, we had our retreat we basically worked on. Scott Casebolt from Etzel helped take the lead with that CPI team, and everything revolved around learning communities, working as a team and enhancing that. We had our own teachers, so we appreciate Dr. Chokol and the teachers here coming and presenting. And so we're going to monitor this, and we do want to continue to enhance our early childhood program. I think it's very important.
Well, Dr. Patterson's results will be particularly important too. Hopefully they'll show, what we think they're going to show, but if they don't, then we revise how we're thinking. So yeah, I can't wait to see those. Trustee Petchikoff.
And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it's a little alarming what the numbers we're looking at, and I don't know if we even have the data for what our current 3rd grade levels were of how many would have fallen into that category of being held back. What kind of numbers could we potentially be looking at if we don't make major improvements of 3rd graders who wouldn't qualify to move ahead? Are we talking hundreds of students that are we're going to have a lot of 3rd grade classrooms in every building that are potentially repeat students?
Well, again, staying positive. Our
Yeah,
goal
that's what I'm
is
hoping,
100% of 3rd grade students at grade level measured either by the state assessment,
I'm saying
the
if
portfolio,
we didn't
or
do
the other
anything.
the other assessment. So we have a couple of measures that we're able to look at. Certainly, the worst case scenario, would be too many students recommended, but we feel with the plan that elementary administrators have worked on and put in place, and the resources, as well as the class size, looking at the not only the general fund, but the millage funds, class sizes have been reduced even lower, even though I think we were among the lowest in Wayne County for our K-2 class size. We have made efforts to reduce that number to even lower levels so that it is possible for teachers to meet with groups of students several times a day. Very, very difficult when you have 27, 28 kids in a classroom to meet with students more than once a day, because there are so many students who need that attention that it's a matter of juggling. When you have 21 or 22, that becomes much more possible. So, certainly the worst case scenario could be many, many students, but again, we're anticipating that number to be in the minority by the time we get there. I think Dr. Patterson will have perhaps not those numbers in his presentation, but certainly an idea of what the trends
I just want to make sure
like.
we have enough time, because we really, we only have a couple of years basically to really get a handle on this.
Well, and we didn't want to rush. We wanted to study the problem, which our team did last year, and then we wanted to carefully determine how we were going to go about it. And even though it was a very awkward time of year to begin a pilot, we also wanted to try a couple test runs in several different places with schools of different sizes. So, River Oaks, Miller, and Henry Ford being the locations. With the leadership of Ashley, Jan, and Kelly, and the administrators and the school teams, as well as the teachers, we were able to problem problem solve a lot of the challenges that came up relative to scheduling, use of materials, communication, how do we progress monitor, how do we enter the data, how do we track all of these things, because we're recommending new practices, and all of that will be in place for all the kindergarten teachers. And then, moving forward, we would like to increase, that level of structure going up.
Okay, thank you.
Great questions, thank you. So thank you for your support.
And Dr. Passion, stay up there.
As we get up the next PowerPoint.
Next report is NWEA Growth.
Okay, good evening, President Lane, Superintendent Maleko, and Board Trustees. I'm going to continue on our previous discussion with some further NWEA data. The outcomes that I'm going to share tonight I would consider to be generally positive. One thing that I would just like to clarify at the beginning is I know that the previous comment from President Lane in terms of the numbers of our kindergarten students entering at grade level does look rather small. The focus of most of my presentation tonight is on student growth, which is different than looking at student status, which is what most of our previous accountability systems has been based on, which is looking at the percentage of students that are proficient or advanced. Much of what we're doing in our new accountability system is looking more on individual student growth. And when we take a look at our NWEA data in terms of how our students are progressing through the year, those outcomes are generally positive and exceed what is typical of students across the nation, and that's what I'll share with you tonight.
I guess that's the miracle that we call public education, teaching and learning.
Yes. So, as Dr. Chokol mentioned, we've been using NWEA for the last 3 years as one measure to help assess our student programs and to provide information to our parents and students on how they are learning. And what I'd like to do tonight is just provide a little bit of background on why we use NWEA, and then I'll provide a little bit of context in terms of what the test is and what it measures, so when we look at the outcomes, we have an understanding of what that is and how we can interpret it. So to begin with, we switched to NWEA 3 years ago for a number of reasons. One of them was the state has made several changes to its state assessment system. So we've gone from the MEP assessment to a short stint with the Smarter Balanced assessment, and now we've been in M-STEP for a few years. At the high school, we've switched from some MEP assessments and the ACT to the SAT, and we wanted something consistent to use for both our parents and students and our own internal evaluation that we could build on from year to year as those measures were changing. We also were able to eliminate many common districts assessments by going to NWEA, and we were also able to use a valid measure and consistent measure for part of our teacher evaluations, which do require some achievement data to be used as part of their effectiveness rating. So we've been doing this for about 3 years now, and we've mentioned NWEA data in many presentations. We just did in the previous one, so we just like to dive in a little deeper with the data tonight. Now, I mentioned earlier that our previous accountability system was primarily built on student status. We took a look at how many students met the proficiency cut point on a test, and schools were rated on the percentage of the students that met that proficiency guideline. There was, pretty widespread kind of criticism using that model because we know that student achievement is really highly correlated with poverty and socioeconomic status. So often schools that served a lot of poor students did not fare well on those measures. And so that's motivated us to use growth measures over the last few years, and the newer accountability system is going to look at student status, but also take a look at how students are growing from year to year. Because a student might be entering third grade below grade level, but they might be making up some ground due to the good teaching that's taking place, but still not be at that proficiency level, and it might take them a couple years to get up there. So what I'd like to just do is just first mention that growth on a very simple skill can be relatively easy to measure. So the first chart that I have up here is just showing just a sample student on a 50 question multiplication time test, how they're tracking from week to week. And on something that's a very simple skill, we can easily track a student's improvement on that. And when you saw the list of assessments that our early childhood specialists use, that we use for progress monitoring, those are all very kind of small, discrete skills that we can measure on a weekly or bi-weekly basis and see how students are tracking on those skills. But when we try to measure a student's trajectory on like a larger set of curriculum, whether it's a year or over the course of several years, and if they are on track from kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade, we need to start making some compromises because the test would become longer because we're covering more curriculum. We need to have a larger item bank because we don't want students to see the same questions over and over again. We need larger amounts of time between the two tests, and we don't want students to have to take too long to take a test several times during the year. So NWEA is one company that's come up with a way to do that allows us to measure student progress 3 times a year without impacting instruction too much by having a test that takes about an hour to an hour and a half to administer, and it helps us see if students are meeting those targets and if they're growing within the school year. So what I'd like to do is just provide a little bit of background on the assessment before we take a look at the results. So just one little minor note is in the district we use NWEA and MAP interchangeably. I just want to point out that NWEA is the company, it's Northwestern Evaluation Associations, and the assessment that we use is called MAP, which is measures of academic progress. You just might hear both of those terms. They all refer to the test that we use. NWEA is what we refer to as a norm reference test. So when a student gets a result back, it doesn't tell the student if they are proficient or advanced. Norm reference tests tell where a student is relative to other students in their sample. So what NWEA does is every few years they take a look at their large populations of students that they've tested across the nation, pull out a representative sample like we would with like a Gallup poll when we're measuring presidential popularity, and they rank those students' performance. And so when a student takes the NWEA MAP assessment, they're shown where they kind of fit within that continuum of students across the nation. And we refer to this as the norm sample. And so the most recent one was done in 2015. That's done every few years just to make sure that we're consistently taking a look at what's kind of common across the nation in terms of student achievement. The NWEA assessment is computer adaptive, and this has become a lot more common in educational assessments. So the student will start off by getting a question that's at grade level, and whether or not they get that question correct or incorrect, the test will become harder or easier for that student. And what happens is as the student progresses through the test, it more accurately measures where they are in that continuum. And computer adaptive test have a couple of benefits. One of those is that we can make the test shorter than it would be if it was a paper and pencil test, and we can also get a more accurate measure of students in a shorter amount of time. In this case, students take about a 50 to 60 question test, and it depends on how well the student is doing and how many they've gotten correct or incorrect to where the test will stop, and it typically takes them about 60 minutes to 90 minutes to complete. And when the student is done, they're going to receive 2 scores. One, which you might have heard of, is called a Rit Score. That comes from a psychometric term, but that's the abbreviation that the testing company uses. It ranges from the low 100s to the high 200s. And the test is constructed in a way so that as a student goes from kindergarten to 1st grade to 2nd grade to 3rd grade, all the way up to 8th grade is the last year that we use the assessment in the district, their scores will get higher and higher on this scale. So by looking at their increases in scores, it makes it easy to track their growth from grade to grade. They're also given a percentile, and this shows where that student is at that time of the year relative to all the other students across the nation. So if a student is given a percentile ranking of 45, it would say that out of 100 students, there would be 45 students below them and 55 students above them in terms of their student achievement on that test. And those norms are created at every grade level for all 3 times during the year. So those are the 2 scores that the students receive. And what I'd like to do is just show you a few pictures of what student growth looks like for students. So the first one that I have, which is this line chart, shows what the average student growth would look like based on this norm sample that was done a couple of years ago. So you can see that in kindergarten, the typical average kindergartner would score about 100, and I believe that's 120 at the beginning of the year. And by the end of the year, they would score about 160. So what that average means is that half of the students in the nation would score higher than that, and half would score lower than that. So that's the median or the middle point, the 50th percentile. So you'll notice that from at the beginning of first grade, the student usually starts out typically at about 160 and grows up to around 180. And as the years progress, the growth of the student trails off a little bit. So we see a lot of growth in the earlier grades and slightly less growth in the later grades. That's going to be important when we take a look at the graphs later on, because typically the growth is higher in the earlier grades and lower in the higher grades. You'll notice in 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I added a couple other colored lines. Because NWEA is norm referenced, and I mentioned that they don't list what proficient or advanced is, the 50th percentile is not necessarily what we want the average student in the nation to be doing. It's just what they are doing. So they've done some studies by taking a look at how 5th graders did in 5th grade, and then how that looked when they were testing for college entry. And what they noticed is that for students that were scoring at either a 22 on the ACT or a 24, which is what you'd need to get in a more exclusive college, they were roughly at around the 69th percentile. And that's where we use that cut point going back to kindergarten based on those earlier slides, because that's kind of the cut point for college and career ready that NWEA has come up with based on their studies. So the black line is where the average student is. Slightly above that is where the kind of expectations for college and career readiness are, and I just wanted to label those on the graph for you. And then on the next slide, now we're going to take a look at what a single student's growth might look like. And this is actually an example of what we would like most of our students to look like. So in this case, you'll see the dark black line represents the student's growth. And this is a student that was assessed from first grade all the way through third grade, 3 times a year. And as you can see, the student scores are getting higher and higher, and in the bubbles are that Rit score that I mentioned. The colors that you'll see, the colored bands, represent different levels of percentiles. So the red is the lowest 20% of our students, which would be 0 to 20 in the percentile, and that top blue bar is the highest 20 percentile of students. So, excuse me, so this is a student that started out in the lowest 20% in first grade, but by the time they were at the end of third grade is almost to the point where they're in the top 20%. And so this shows a student's trajectory over time in terms of where they are in that broader spectrum of student achievement. And then one other report that I'd like to show you is this is something that is often shared with our parents during parent-teacher conferences. And typically parents want to know a few things about their child's achievement. One is, are they doing okay? One is, how are they doing compared to their peers? And how are they doing compared to like their larger set of peers across the state or the nation? And so this graph shows this. So the blue line would represent the student's achievement. The orange line would represent the average district achievement, and the yellow would represent the norm reference achievement based on students across the nation. And so this is something that we use to have dialogues with parents in terms of where the student's achievement is and what are some of the next steps that we can use based on their individual progress. So in terms of growth, if we take a look at our district outcomes, the main takeaway is that although we know that we have students that are coming in below grade level, if we take a look at the amount of learning that's taken place as measured by growth on NWEA, we, in every single grade and in every single subject, we exceed those norms that NWEA has created based on the national sample. So what is typical of the nation in pretty much every grade and every subject, we exceed those in terms of within year growth. And we can also take a look at that in terms of where our students start in kindergarten and where the average student is by the end of 8th grade when we're done with NWEA. So I'll show you a few graphs just to illustrate that. The next graph is showing 2 years of our NWEA growth. This is just for mathematics, and it's comparing it to the NWEA norm. So the 2 blue lines represent the last 2 years of how much our students on average grew within that year, and the green line you will see is the average growth based on the NWEA representative sample. One thing I'd like to point out is if you recall from the previous graph with the lines, We see a lot of growth in kindergarten and first grade, and the growth starts to tailor off a little bit as we get to 8th grade. That's just typical across the nation. So the lower lines in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade don't mean that our students are doing worse. It's just that's what the typical growth is. So you'll see in every single grade here that the last 2 years, the growth that our students see within the school year is above average in terms of NWEA. One other thing I'd like to highlight is often when we take a look at student achievement results, we do see some gaps in terms of how some of our subgroups do. Our socioeconomically disadvantaged students, our English learners typically have a gap in terms of overall student achievement. If you take a look at the next slide in terms of how those subgroups fare in terms of growth throughout the year, this slide is showing our English learners in math, and our English learners are actually growing equally to our non-English learners, and in many cases exceeding their growth due to the specialized services and instruction that we're providing for them. I didn't put it in the slideshow, but we'll see similar patterns for our socioeconomically disadvantaged and our students with disability groups as well. Okay. So the remaining slides will just show that growth for reading, which we administer from K through 8th grade, and then also language and science, but we'll see that the pattern is similar across all of those. So the key takeaway is that although many of our students do come in with some gaps, the learning that's taking place within the school year is outpacing what is typically seen in the NWEA sample based on their norming study.
That's fabulous. That's great news. Trustee Teschikoff.
While I like that, and I've seen this used with the at a school improvement, how they use this for the individualized students' growth. I do have a question about, does NWEA share who we're being compared to with the norm nationwide? I mean, do we know how broad a net is in the nation? Individual districts are using this? Are they comparative to a district of our size, or are they all southern districts or northern? I mean, how do we know that norm really reflects a good balance of the nation?
Okay. That's a good question. And in terms of certain characteristics, Dearborn is an outlier in some cases in terms of like the number of student of English learners that we service. There are other districts around the nation that use that, but I don't know if anyone would be in their norming study other than our own. And we actually have participated in the norming study, so we submitted data to them in recent years to be part of that study. They do release a technical guide to how their norms are created, which outline the districts that were used, the percentage of students in that population that were English learners, students with disabilities, and low economically disadvantaged
Whether it's
students as
urban
well.
or rural or all those kinds of things.
And they do try to employ good statistical models for that, so they will oversample English learners and special students with special disabilities as well, to make sure that it is as representative as possible. So it might not be exactly a match for Dearborn, but they do try to make an effort to make sure it's representative of what the nation's students look like.
Okay.
Trustee Thorpe.
You mentioned how in the older grades, I think it was 6th, 7th, and 8th, where you showed the ACT line. Because we now switched to the SAT, are we switching that over as to where you would be to be on target for that?
Yes, and that's actually additional data that we provided to NWEA last year. They're doing a new norming study based on the SAT as well. The SAT was redesigned 2 years ago, so the data is relatively new, but I would imagine that the college and career cut point for both of those assessments is going to be pretty similar. And when we've looked at that for Smarter Balanced and M-STEP correlations, typically it's around the high 60s to low 70th percentile is what students need to get to be college and career ready on those assessments.
Great.
Dr. Patterson, how much time do students throughout the spectrum, how much time are they spending on testing now? I know teaching to the test has always been a big issue, and then a couple of years ago when we switched over on different tests, the amount of time spent in testing was another big issue. So I think you said that with NWEA, we're eliminating some of the other tests. So how much are we testing right now, throughout our grades?
So it varies a little bit by grade level, and we did make an effort last year to eliminate some of our required district assessments. Not that teachers can't use them when they would like to, but we did reduce some social studies and writing assessments. On average, I would say it's around, over the course of the year, about 20 hours. And that represents maybe about 1.5% of instructional time. And when we were doing a study to see how much time students are taking testing, there's not a lot of data out there across the nation on what schools are doing. There was a study done a couple of years ago by the League of Great City Schools, which is around 70 of the largest urban districts around the nation. They polled all of their districts in terms of how much students are assessed. And after we did our reduction of assessments last year, we're now below average based on what those other urban districts are doing. And the goal, I think, of our new accountability system, which is what Mr. Whiston is proposing, is that a similar growth measure to NWEA. And if that is something that comes into place, then we would be able to transition to an assessment like that and not have to use NWEA in place of the state assessment.
Yeah, let's hope the state doesn't change it again. I mean, that literally is millions and millions of dollars every time they change that, and I hope people understand that not only is their new test prepared, but the amount of staff time that goes into that is just massive, so hopefully they'll stick with it. Trustee Barry, do you have a point? No? Oh, okay. Anybody else? Oh,
Just
Dr.
one thing
Malenko.
too, with the chatting with the superintendent events that we started in January, Dr. Patterson, I think, came with me at every event, and that was one of the most popular topics among the parent was the assessment, and they really were we were gathering that data, and so along with hearing from the staff, that went into the decision where we actually, he sent out a memo, I believe it was around April, and we basically reduced our assessments even more, but saying that we're going to stick with one like NWEA that gives us that, we're confident in that assessment. And so when we did move to that a few years ago, I was in human resources at the time. Part of it was for, evaluations and other things, but it was to try to look at reducing the amount of testing for students. And that was something that we heard loud and clear from the parents when we went. I think it came up at every single one of the sessions. So.
And as a parent of an elementary and middle school child, everybody had a sigh of relief when you announced that we were cutting back on some of the assessments, because especially at the end of the year when you're stacking up M-STEP and NWEA and all the other ones, those kids were burnt out.
It's the one thing I heard routinely from parents in the district.
Too much testing.
I have a quick question. Do the
Yes.
parents receive the sample parent report for their children by request, or is that given to every student if they would like to see where their child stands?
I believe the schools determine how those results are distributed during parent conferences. I'm not aware if that's something that is consistent in terms of which report is given all 3 times a year, but it is put on the report card for every marking period after the NWEA assessment, so they will see the results that way as well.
Okay, thank you.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Good news.